We're starting a brand new series of messages this morning. You guys ready? We are going to start a series on the book of Nehemiah. I'm sure that most of you here have heard of Nehemiah. Many of you have probably heard messages on Nehemiah before, but I want to encourage you to pretend that this is your first time ever reading the story, your first time ever hearing the story. Let's open our eyes, ears, and hearts to hear something new from an old story. Let's start with a little bit of history so we can understand what's happening here in this book. The story of Nehemiah actually starts way before Nehemiah. It starts with God's promise to Abraham in the book of Genesis. God asks Abraham to leave the country of his birth and move to a new place that God will show him. God's promise is that if Abraham will be obedient and put his faith in God, he will be blessed. God will give him many descendants and turn it into a great nation. God also promises Abraham that the new land that he will be taken to will be given to him and his descendants forever. God kept his promise to Abraham. However, there were many detours along the way. There were numerous times when the Israelites were taken from the land that God had promised them. Once it was because there was famine, and so they traveled to Egypt, which still had food, and we've heard that story of Joseph, how they went there because Joseph was there, and that was God's provision to provide for them through the family. They ended up spending 400 years there. But most of the time, the reason they had to leave the land was because they had not followed God's commands. The promises of God are always tied to his commands. We can't expect to get the promises of God if we're not following the commandments of God. Sometimes it would take a while, but each time the Israelites were punished by God, they would eventually turn their hearts back to God. And when they did, God would renew the promise and once again begin to have his blessings flowing on them, and he would take them back to their homeland again. The high point of Israel's history was when King David sat on the throne. For 40 years, there was expansion and influence for the people of God. The expansion and influence continued for the first part of Solomon's reign, but then things began to fall apart. Solomon made some big mistakes in the latter part of his life. And after he passed away and his sons took over the kingdom, Israel was actually split into two separate kingdoms at that time. The northern kingdom was known as Israel. The southern kingdom was known as Judah. The kingdom of Israel was the first to reject God. And as a result, God allowed Assyria to come in and conquer them. But instead of learning from the mistakes of Israel, Judah slowly turned their backs on God too. The people refused to listen to the warnings that God issued through the prophets. So in 587 BC, the Babylonians invaded Judah and pretty much destroyed the whole kingdom. The capital city, Jerusalem, was leveled, and even the great temple, which Solomon had built, was torn to the ground. Many of the people in Judah were taken from their land and sold into slavery in the Babylonian Empire. The strongest and wisest, became the servants to the king himself. That pretty much the only people they left behind in Jerusalem, or in Judah for that matter, were the weak. Those who they didn't feel that could do anything. They were of no value to the Babylonians, so they simply left them to starve to death or something and took the stronger people with them. And that's where we get the stories of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were taken to be servants in the Babylonian Empire. Now fast forward 70 years from that time, and a new kingdom rose to power. The Persian Empire came to be. King Cyrus from Persia defeated Babylon. But instead of forcing all the Israelites to stay and work as slaves, he allowed them the freedom to go back home. He said, you can stay here in Babylon, or you can come to Persia, be part of the new capital, or if you want, you can take this opportunity to return to your land. For roughly the next 100 years, in about 3 different stages, tens of thousands of Israelites returned to Jerusalem to try and rebuild what Babylon had destroyed. The first thing they rebuilt was the temple. They rebuilt the temple exactly the way that Solomon had built it originally. They spared no expense. And now there was a beautiful temple standing in a pile of rubble. About 35 years ago, I went on a MAPS trip to Quito, Ecuador. We went to build a Bible school there. And while we were there, we had the opportunity to visit some of the large Catholic churches there in Ecuador. The churches were huge. They were ornate. Everywhere you looked, there was marble, and there was gold, and there was silver. They had spared no expense on building these beautiful temples. But when you walked outside of the temples, right next to the churches, right next to the churches were cardboard shacks. People were living in homes that they built out of cardboard, or some of them didn't even have homes. They simply slept under a tarp or something, kind of like what we see in some areas of our city. Beautiful churches, but around the churches, slums. Another thing that was evident in Ecuador was that even though they had beautiful churches, the nation was dead spiritually. They had these great places which were set up as basically monuments to God, but the spiritual climate of the country was dead. Many people would faithfully go to the weekly mass out of tradition, but love and dedication to God was void. What happened in those weekly masses offered a brief respite from the harsh realities of what was happening outside the walls of the church, but there was no internal life change that happened that would impact their lives when they left the church and went back into their society. What I saw in Quito, Ecuador is the picture of what I have in mind when I think about what Jerusalem must have looked like when we get to the first part of Nehemiah. There was once again a temple, and temple rituals had been reinstituted, but there was no true worship, no true knowledge of God. It was simply tradition, just going through the motions. People would go to the temple to escape reality for a short time, but then they would return to the rubble of their city, and nothing would change. Nehemiah is known primarily as the man who rebuilt the walls of the city. But in the end of the book, we're going to see that Nehemiah was also the one that brought true worship back to Jerusalem. After he got the walls built, he stayed and he taught them what it was like to really, truly worship God. And he turned their hearts back to the true God. At the beginning of the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah is living in Persia. He's working for King Artaxerxes. He's not a slave. He's actually getting paid to work for the king. And we're going to see later that he is compensated very well for his work. Because of his position, he has chosen to stay in Persia instead of returning to his homeland. But one of his brothers had gone back to Jerusalem, and his brother comes to Persia for a visit. Now, Nehemiah probably has never seen Jerusalem himself. He was born, his parents were probably slaves or servants in the Babylonian Empire. He had been in Babylon, somehow accepted this position, and now he's in Persia working for the king in Persia. He's never been to Jerusalem, but he knows it's part of his heritage. And just like the trend is now for people to trace their ancestry back and see where they come from and find as much about their ancestry as they can, he's curious as to what is my homeland like? I've never been there, but I'm curious. What is it like? What's happening to the people who were there? So he asks his brother. When his brother comes, he says, what is it like in Jerusalem? And then we get to Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. If you have your Bibles and you want to turn there, you can follow along. It will be on the screen. It says, in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, because basically Nehemiah is Nehemiah writing his story. This is what happened. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. That's not the response that Nehemiah was expecting. He had heard that the temple had been rebuilt, and probably he's assuming the city was rebuilt along with the temple. He's expecting a great report of how everything is going well. There's probably still work to be done, but everything is getting back to normal. And he gets this report that even though the temple is there, the city is in rubble. The walls are still laying in rubble. In fact, notice what he says. He says the people are living in disgrace. The people are in disgrace. Now we need to pause here. There's something that differs a bit from our modern culture. In today's society, often walls are talked about in very negative terms. To many people, walls represent separation, bondage, lack of ability to move freely. Walls represent something bad. We will tell people that they need to ask God to break down the walls in their life. You ever heard somebody say that? You need to just tear down those walls. When we think about walls in today's society, and even so much more in today's church world, it often has a negative connotation and is quickly followed by our encouragement, tear down the walls. Don't let anything hold you back. But that's not what walls represented in Nehemiah's time. In fact, walls back in the day of Nehemiah carried at least 3 very positive connotations. First, they provided safety and security. A good, strong wall kept the enemies, the invaders, the people that meant to harm them out. Walls enabled children to play in the streets, families to eat dinner in peace, and believers to worship God. Secondly, walls were actually a symbol of God's strength. They represented God's protection and blessing and hand upon a group of people. A strong, solid wall around Jerusalem, or any other city for that matter, meant that God, or if you weren't a believer in the true God, the gods were blessing you. And the walls represented his blessing and his protection. On the contrary, a depleted, destroyed, or demolished wall was actually a poor reflection upon God or the gods to other nations. Your God wasn't strong enough to protect you, so your wall has been torn down. If your wall was standing, it was seen as a blessing from the gods. You are strong because of the God that you worship. He kept the enemy out. Not that the walls were gods, but it was a sign that your gods were powerful. With the walls being broken down, it was a symbol to all the other nations that the God of Israel was not as powerful as the God of the Babylonians, because the Babylonians were able to take down the wall. Now, a third thing that a wall represented was the fulfillment of a vision. It was the last piece of the puzzle that said, we have accomplished the establishment that God called us to. We have built the temple. We've established our nation. We restored the holy city and secured it with the wall. The vision that God placed in our heart for his kingdom has been accomplished. It would represent an incredible accomplishment, the completion of a vision, because they had for years wanted to go back. Part of that vision was to have it back the way it was, a secure city. And by the walls not being completed, the vision hadn't been fulfilled. That's the context with which we need to view the walls for the next few weeks together. Not as a negative thing that we need to tear down in our lives. It's a symbol of God's plan, God's purpose, the fulfillment of all that God has. Walls are not intended to keep everything out. A proper wall was designed only to keep the bad things out. Walls always have gates that can be opened for those that we decide to let in. Our friends are willing to come through the gate. It's our enemies that try to come over the wall. Walls aren't always physical. Few people understand this. In the computer world, there's something we call a firewall. A firewall is a system that's designed to prevent unauthorized access to or from a private network. It's to keep what's on your computer just for you or those you give access. It's designed to keep hackers, to keep people who want to spread viruses. It's designed to keep them out of your system. So a wall is not always physical. A wall is simply something that says, I get to decide who has access and who doesn't. It's not a free-for-all. I can decide if someone is safe or someone means to cause me danger. So when we come to understand that context for a wall, then we can begin to understand Nehemiah's response when he heard that the walls of the city were still laying in rubble. Now let me ask you this morning, have you ever been there in your own life? Once upon a time, you had a vision, a picture in your mind of what life would look like. Maybe when you were young, you looked forward 20 years or 25 years, and you said, when I get to this point, I'm going to have this, and I'm going to have that, and I'm going to be doing this, and I'm going to be doing that. But that vision hasn't come to pass. Your life is nowhere close to what you envisioned it. And you say, why is my life in shambles? You saw the home, you saw the spouse, you saw the children, you saw the job, you saw the income, you saw the vacations, you saw the cars, you saw the family moments. You saw it all. You had this great vision for success in your life, or what you thought was success in your life. That's what Nehemiah was looking for. He was looking for a report that everything was great. Everything was what they had dreamed of. Everything was what they had been praying for. And then in what seemed like a blink of an eye, you woke up one morning and found yourself surrounded by rubble. All the work you'd been doing, all the wall construction that you had given so much time and energy to, all the blueprints and dreams you had hoped for, are now laying in a pile at your feet. Rubble. It's been approximately 160 years since Jerusalem had been destroyed at this point. It's been 90 years since the exiles began to return to Jerusalem from exile. 90 years of people living back in the city, and still the walls are laying in shambles. Nothing has been done to restore the glory of the city. Everyone else might have accepted things the way they are. It's safe to say that a whole generation of people had grown up in that city with no walls. And to them it was normal. This is the way it's always been. We have young people in this room who have grown up in a society with certain things, just thinking this is normal. This is just the way things have always been. No, it's not the way it's always been. There are walls that have crumbled that need to be rebuilt. Everyone else either just said, well, this is the way it's supposed to be, or this is the way it's going to be. We may not like it, but that's just the way it is. It's the new reality. I guess we've just got to get used to it. But Nehemiah saw it differently. When Nehemiah heard about the condition of the walls, he decided he was going to do something about it. So we pick up the story in verse 4. He says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. I want you to notice the first thing Nehemiah did was pray. Well, actually, the first thing he did was wept. His heart was broken. He was so taken back by the condition, by the report that he got. His heart broke, and he wept. And then through his tears, he cried out to God. Throughout this series, we're going to learn how to make a difference in this world. I think that almost all of us here would agree the world is falling apart. Those of us who have been around a while can actually remember the way things used to be. The younger generation may not remember when things were different, but they can still point at things that are wrong. But too many people simply shrug their shoulders and say, I wish it was different, but what can I do about it? I don't think Nehemiah knew yet that he would be the one to rebuild the walls. All he knew was something wasn't right, and it broke his heart, and so he poured out his heart to God. And that's the first step in making something better. The first step is having our hearts broken, and then through our pain, going to God, saying, God, this isn't right. I'm not going to accept that this is the new reality. It's not right. God, do something. We may not know what to do, but God does. Nehemiah poured his heart out to God. Now, from reading this passage, I get the feeling that at times he didn't even know what to say. He simply wept before God. Verse 4 says, he mourned and fasted and prayed for days. When's the last time you wanted something so bad that you spent days praying for it? I mean, to a lot of us, 5 minutes is a long time. He fasted and prayed for days. I'm not talking about a 30-second prayer each day. It wasn't just part of his morning routine. God, thank you for helping make it through the night. Bless my day. And, oh, yeah, God, do something about the city. Okay, I prayed. I get the impression that any time there wasn't something else going on, I mean, he did still have his job. He still had to go to work. But even during his break times at work, he'd lock himself up and he'd pray and say, God, my heart is breaking. Can't you do something about this mess? It says he spent days. Well, actually, when we get to the next chapter, and I'll explain that in just a minute, he actually spent almost 4 months. He says days, but it was almost, in fact, it could have been 4 months, praying, fasting, crying before God, saying, God, you've got to fix this. How do I know it was 4 months? Because Nehemiah 1:1, which you just read, said the story starts in the month of Kislev. Kislev responds to January on our calendar, actually the end of December and the first part of January. That's the month of Kislev, okay? When we get to chapter 2, we're going to see it takes place in the month of Nisan. Nisan corresponds to April on our calendar. So he prayed from at least January until April, possibly mid-December through whatever in April. So about for 4 months, he's praying. And then the last verse of chapter 1 tells us the conversation that we see happening in chapter 2. Or the last verse tells us about a conversation that we're going to see happening in chapter 2, which is the same day that this prayer that we're going to read took place. So he's been fasting, weeping, praying, pouring his heart out to God for 4 months. And then we get to this prayer at the end of chapter 1. Nehemiah's already been praying for 4 months. We don't know what he prayed during that time. Maybe it was similar to what we have here. We don't know exactly what he's praying, but we know that now he prays. And before we read the prayer, I want you to look with me at 2 Chronicles 7:14, because this prayer follows the model of 2 Chronicles 7:14. Now, you shouldn't even have to turn there. By now, you should have this memorized, because I go back to the scripture all the time. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14 says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. God says he will do it, but it only happens if we do our part, which is humble ourselves, pray, and turn from our wicked ways. Because, see, we always want to say, well, they're more evil than I am. If they would just change, the world would be a better place. How many you don't have to raise your hand here, but how many of you are man enough or woman enough to admit that you're not perfect? You've got some sin in your life too. Now, I want you to notice when we get to this prayer, Nehemiah doesn't just pray for the sins of the people. Yes, the people were still living in sin. And he repents for them. But he also admits he's not perfect. And he says, I'm sorry for my sins too. He follows the perfect example of what we just read in 2 Chronicles 7:14. His prayer fits that description perfectly. So now, with that in mind, let's look at the prayer that Nehemiah prayed, starting with verse 5. He says, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer that your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins that we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws that you gave your servant Moses. remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place that I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. And then we get this last part. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. What man? We're going to learn that next week. The king. Give me favor as I go to talk to the king. In chapter 2, Nehemiah is going to go to the king, and we're told it's the same day. It says, give me favor this day. He's going to go to the king and ask the king if he can take a leave of absence from his job and go rebuild the walls of the city. Chapter 1 took place, as I've already said, over a period of 4 months. It was a 4-month process to get us to chapter 2. Let's review what we've learned so far today, because there are steps that are necessary. If we're going to change our world, or if we're going to see our world change, these things have to happen. Nehemiah tells us how we can make a difference in the world. Number 1, you have to see the problem. See, if you don't think there's a problem, you're never going to get to step 2. You have to see the problem. But more than that, you have to understand that it's a problem. You have to understand that it's not right. See, everybody else saw the problem. Nehemiah's brothers saw the problem. The people living in Jerusalem saw the problem. But they didn't go to the next step. They simply said, oh, well, we don't like it, but that's the way it is. You have to see the problem. And then 2, if you see the problem through God's eyes, you have to let your heart break. You have to weep. It can't just be, there's a problem, but I can't do anything. It has to be, I've got to do something. Somebody has to do something. I'm not going to let it continue. Your heart has to break over what you see. This is a major step. Because a lot of people see the problem, but they try to forget about it or ignore it. Other people will just complain about it. I don't like it. I wish it wasn't that way. I wish all those people who made it that way would just get out of here. We like to complain about it, but our hearts aren't broken over the problem. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan? 3 people saw the man living in the ditch. 2 people were just disgusted. Ooh, there's blood. Ooh, I can't get that on my clothes. Oh. 2 people were disgusted by the problem, and they walked away. But 1 saw the problem, and his heart broke. It says he had compassion. In other words, he felt. We need to have compassion. Because until we have compassion, until our heart is broken and we can actually feel the pain, we'll never go to the next step. Many people saw the rubble in Jerusalem, but it wasn't until Nehemiah's heart broke that anything changed, which takes us to step 3. Once our heart is broken because we know it's not right and because we know it grieves God's heart, we take it to God in prayer. And we say, I am going to get on my face before God, and I am going to pray until something happens. I'm not going to just pray one time and say, okay, God heard me. I am going to pray, and I am going to pray, and I am going to pray, and I am going to keep praying. I'm not giving up until God does something. But I got to warn you, if you begin to pray like that and say, God, do something, God is probably going to ask you to do something. Maybe that's why sometimes we don't pray. We see the problem. We want somebody to get involved, but we're afraid if we pray, God's going to ask us to do something. You know what? He probably will. But we have to be willing to listen to him to tell us what we can do about the problem. Because God always solves problems through people. He does the real work, but he does it through people. You're not going to find very many times in the Bible where somebody wasn't involved in the process. The Red Sea parted so the Israelites could walk across, but Moses had to do his part. He had to hold his staff out over the waters. God brought water out of a rock, but Moses had to do his part. Jesus multiplied loaves and fishes, but somebody had to bring in the lunch. God works through us. Are we willing to listen to God and say, okay, God, I've seen the problem. I'm broken up about this problem. I'm praying about this problem. The problem is we do all the talking. See, part of our prayer time needs to be being quiet and listening. So, okay, God, I've talked to you about the problem. I'm asking you to fix it. So, God, is there anything that I can do? And I'm not sure where in the process that revelation came to Nehemiah. I don't think that he immediately, when his brother gave him the report, immediately said, I'm going to do something. I think it started out simply praying. But it was sometime during that process. In fact, in my own story, now, this may not be the way it happened. This is just my story, okay? And since I'm telling the story, I get to do it my way. I think it was as he was praying that prayer that we just read. As he was praying that prayer and reminding God of all of his promises and saying, God, what we have, we deserve. The Babylonians came in. I mean, this is a paraphrase of this. The Babylonians came in and took over because we had turned our backs. We had rejected you. I mean, this was all part of your promise. And I know why we're there, but still, it's a bad thing. But God, remember, you also said that if your people would turn back to you, that you would renew the promise, that you would renew the blessings. And he stopped and he repented for the sins of his nation and he repented for his sins. So now, God, now that we're repenting, God, keep your promise. And I think God spoke to him and said, okay, Nehemiah, let's go do it. I think at that time, God said, okay, Nehemiah, you see what I see. You know it's not right. So let's do this together. That may have been another time. That's just the way I'm sticking with the story, okay? But at some point, God said, okay, Nehemiah, your heart's in the right place. You've got concern for the city. So let's go do something together. Worship team, you go ahead and come up and get ready. Nehemiah didn't know immediately how to solve the problem. All he knew was there was a problem that needed to be solved. And he knew that God could solve it. His heart was broken, and he fasted and prayed until the answer came. But the answer probably wasn't what he originally expected. The answer was, you go. You do it. So Nehemiah says, okay, God, I don't know what I'm doing. I've never done this before. But if you want me to do something, I'm willing to go. We love to pray, Lord, send somebody. But how often do we say, God, am I the one? Do you want me to do something? Are we even open to the possibility that since we're the ones that saw the problem, we may have seen it because God wants us to be involved and do something about the problem? As we continue through the book of Nehemiah, we're going to learn that Nehemiah wasn't successful because he had great knowledge or experience. He wasn't a builder. As far as we know, he had never done anything like this in his life. He had probably never lifted a rock in his life. He didn't have to. He didn't know what he was doing. But God's not looking for great talent or great wisdom. God will give us what we need when we need it. What God's looking for is obedience. In fact, if you look at most of the people that God used in the Bible, they had absolutely no idea how to do what they did. I don't get the picture that Noah knew how to build a boat. But God said, do it. I'm going to give you the plans. I'm going to help you do it. God's not looking for talent or wisdom. So we always say, well, God, you need to send somebody that knows what they're doing. God says, no, I'm going to send you. because you don't know what you're doing. Because I found that when I don't know what I'm doing, that's when God can really do something, because I have to listen to him. If I try to do it in my own strength, I can do a little bit. But when I rely on God's strength and wisdom, everything comes together. Many of you have undoubtedly heard of a man named Dwight Moody. When D.L. Moody was just a young man, he heard a preacher say, "The world has yet to see what God can do with a man that is fully surrendered to him." That night, Moody got on his knees and he said, "By God's grace, I will be that man." Moody didn't have much formal education. He wasn't a polished speaker. But God used him to reach 2 continents with the gospel. He presented the plan of salvation by voice or by writing. He presented the gospel to at least 2 million people in his lifetime. He often spoke to audiences of 10 to 20,000 people at one time, and he wasn't a trained speaker. It's estimated that over 1 million people came to Christ as a result of his ministry. Now, I think we can all agree there are problems in the world, problems in the nation, problems in our city that need to be solved. None of us can solve them all, but with God's help, each of us can solve 1 or 2 of them. We've got to just say, "God, which ones do you want me to get involved in? What do you have for me to do?" Simply seeing a problem isn't enough. God's looking for people who will allow their hearts to be broken. And then because their hearts are broken, they cry out to him. God promises that if we humble ourselves and pray and then do what he asks us to do, he will heal our land. But we need to pray. As I said, part of prayer is listening. What does God want me to do? So I've got a question. What breaks your heart? Is there anything that breaks your heart, or you just see things as, I'm just praying that God will take me out of this place and I won't have to worry about it? We all need to be broken over something. What is it that breaks your heart? What keeps you up at night? Now, if your heart isn't broken about something, I'm sure you've seen a lot of things, but you're just letting them go by. If your heart's not breaking about something, maybe that's your first step, is to begin to pray and say, "Lord, help me see the world through your eyes. Don't let me see it through what CNN or CBS or NBC tells me to see. Let me see what you see. And Lord, break my heart for what breaks your heart." Because only when we see it through God's eyes, only when we allow our hearts to break and then take it to him, will things begin to get better. Heavenly Father, thank you for this story of Nehemiah. Because Nehemiah really should be a representation of all of us. There are lessons that we can learn about what can happen. Things don't have to stay the way they are. But we need to humble ourselves. We need to begin to seek your face. And then we need to honor you, to obey you, to do what you ask us to do. And you will give us the right tools, the wisdom, whatever is necessary, you will give it to us at the right time. We need to be willing to be involved in the process, because you always work through people. I pray that you would begin to speak to each of us. Show us the job that you have for us to do. Show us where we can be instrumental in changing the world. Let your kingdom come. Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But that's only going to happen when we get involved in the process. We will be the ones to help bring your kingdom to earth. Break our hearts. let us be willing to say, here I am, Lord. Send me. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.